From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Check. Check.
Okay, while everybody's getting ready
Check.
up here, getting mic'd up.
Check.
Good afternoon. I am Donald Scott, the Deputy Librarian of Congress, in which the home of the Veterans History Project.
Moderator, Mike?
And we are very pleased that you chose to come to this, the last interview of the Tuskegee Airmen for this 4-day celebration. Now, while I said this is the last interview for today, it does not mean that the Veterans History Project will not continue to do interviews of veterans from World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and up through the Persian Gulf. We will continue to do that. And so we want to urge all of you out there who know veterans to please ask them to tell their story. And I'm sure that I don't need to tell you how important it is that each veteran, regardless of the war they served in, but especially the World War II veterans, be sure to get their story recorded. And you know why it's important. But it's more important for those who are not here that you go back and tell them, because if you had a relative who served, then that story becomes a real live, active record at the Library of Congress that can be accessed by future generations. And so it is very nice to know that a great-great-grandson can tell his or her playmate that my great-great-grandfather's story is at the Library of Congress. So please accept the responsibility and go out and make sure that we get as many of these stories recorded as we possibly can. For this afternoon, the panelists are Lieutenant Colonel Lee Archer. Lee's the one that's talking to Todd Boyd. Lee is a native of New York City. He's America's first black ace. He joined the Army Air Force in 1941, and he trained at the virtually all-black Tuskegee Army Flying School in Tuskegee, Alabama. After graduating from the Tuskegee program, Archer shipped overseas as a replacement pilot of the 302nd Pursuit Squadron, 332nd Fighter Group in 1943. By the end of the war, Archer had 169 missions and 5 kills to his credit. Ironically, it took the Air Force more than 50 years to recognize this particular distinction. Mr. Archer, no stranger to success, retired from the Air Force after a 29-year career to become a highly successful businessman. He is now Chairman and CEO of Archer Associates and serves on the board of several corporations. He is active in many civic and educational organizations and is a member of the Veterans History Project, and he is a member of the 5-Star Council. Next is Colonel Charles Mcgee. Colonel Mcgee flew in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, and he holds the record for the most missions flown in combat by any American pilot. Mcgee suspended his education at the University of Illinois to join the Army Air Force in 1942, and he too trained at Tuskegee Army Flying School, the only Air Corps facility open to African Americans at the time. In 1943, he joined the Tuskegee Airmen as a combat pilot in the European Theater of War, where he flew 143 missions. Mcgee retired from the Air Force in 1973 after a 30-year career. Among his many medals and awards are the Legion of Merit, Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters, a Bronze Star, Air Medal with 25 oak leaf clusters. Now a resident of Bethesda, Maryland, Colonel Mcgee is active in several local and national community service groups, and he is the immediate past president of the Tuskegee Airmen. a national nonprofit organization that educates Americans from the historic Tuskegee Airmen experience and introduces the minority youth to careers in aviation. And finally, the man who kept the planes flying, Tech Sergeant Thomas Lowery. Sergeant Lowery was a crew chief in the all-black 477th Medium Bombardment Group. The 477th was not deployed overseas during World War II, but the men of the group fought important battles here at home. At bases throughout the United States, the officers and enlisted men of the 477th faced extreme prejudice, but they demanded equal treatment from their white counterparts. On more than one occasion, Lowery witnessed German POWs being served in whites-only facilities at stateside air bases, facilities that he and his fellow soldiers could not use simply because of the color of their skin. Despite having to expend their energies on these clashes, the crews of the 477th amassed the best safety record of the stateside 1st Air Force. As Mr. Lowery is fond of reminding people, it was these crews of support personnel and not the chauffeurs, the mechanics, term for the pilots, those two sitting over there, that kept the planes flying. He continues to work as an electrician and mechanic and is active in local antique automobile club. And finally, the man who has done a yeoman's job of telling the Tuskegee Airmen story is Todd Moy. Moy is the director of the Tuskegee Airmen Oral History Project of the National Park Service Southeast Regional Office in Atlanta, Georgia. He is a civil rights historian, and Moy has served on that project for 4 years. He's also written a book, and the book will be out in 2004, and it has to do with the civil rights movement in Sunflower County, Mississippi. And so please join in listening to the real-life exploits of those who made history. I'll turn it over to Mr. Moy.
Thank you very much, General Scott. Just a brief plug for the Tuskegee Airmen Oral History Project. This is an initiative of the National Park Service in support of the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site that we're developing in Tuskegee, Alabama, and which we hope will be open to you by 2008. But the oral histories that we are recording will enable visitors 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now who will never have a chance to meet a Tuskegee Airman a chance to learn this story from the airmen themselves in their own voices and in their own words. But we have a chance to learn that today ourselves. And I think you're really in for a treat. What I'd like to do really briefly is provide just a brief history lesson. As all of you know, or I hope all of you know, African Americans have served the United States in every war since the beginning. But in World War I, it's no secret that the commanders of the United States war effort had racist ideas about African Americans and weren't sure how they could best use African American soldiers. Following the First World War, they commissioned a study from the Army War College, which was produced in 1925 and was the basis for War Department policy up to the very eve of World War II. I'll read from it directly. It concluded that, and I quote, "The Negro is by nature subservient and believes himself to be inferior to the white man. He cannot control himself in the face of danger to the extent the white man can. He has not the initiative nor the resourcefulness of the white man. He's mentally inferior to the white man. And it's recommended that this study be taken as the basis of policy of the War Department." It was taken as the basis of policy for the War Department. As it became increasingly clear in the late 1930s that the United States would have to enter the Second World War, the generals in the Army Air Corps had no intention whatsoever of training African American pilots or African American support personnel. They thought that it would be a waste of time to try and train African Americans to fly and maintain airplanes. they had to fight for their right to fight. It was only through the intense lobbying efforts of civil rights groups like the NAACP and the black press and historically black colleges that the Army Air Corps was forced to open a training program for African Americans. But African Americans did win the opportunity to be trained as Air Corps pilots. They trained at Tuskegee, Alabama, in the heart of the segregated South. And by war's end, about 450 of the over 900 graduates of the pilot program had served overseas with great distinction. Most famously, the Tuskegee Airmen were given the role of flying fighter escort for American bombers deep into American territory off of the coast of Italy, and never lost a single bomber to enemy planes. They're the only group in the war, in that war or any other war, that could make such a claim. And if that were the only thing we had to celebrate about the Tuskegee Airmen, it would be reason enough for today's program and for the development of the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. But of course, there's more to the story. For instance, the 477th Bombardment Group that trained at Tuskegee, an all-black bomber group that was never given the opportunity to serve overseas, fought several battles here at home against segregation at home. Mr. Lowery is a veteran of that experience, and he'll be talking about that today. One thing I want you to go away from today is that everyone who was involved in this experience was a civil rights pioneer, because everyone from the pilots to the parachute packers to the mechanics and secretaries busted a stereotype, made it impossible for white Americans to believe that black Americans couldn't do anything they could do after the war's end. And it's impossible to imagine the American Civil Rights Movement happening when it did if it had not been for the Tuskegee Airmen. That's a brief history. We'll start this off with Colonel Archer. I'd like for you to tell me when you knew you wanted to be a pilot.
I wanted to be a pilot since I was a little boy. In fact, okay, good deal. I was one of the kids that had little model airplanes from World War I hanging around the house. My mother said you could lose an eye walking through the room from hanging on a series. I used to see airplanes coming into an area that I lived in Saratoga with the little airplanes coming in, small ones that came up for the racetrack season. And I loved to see them. I used to hang out at the airport and take a look at them. And I wanted to. I was reading also, as some of the other fellows will tell you, that we were reading about World War I fighter pilots and their work and how they did about it. So I always wanted to. I didn't know that I was not permitted, that I should be an Air Corps man. And when World War II started, I could see what was coming down the ramp. I applied to go to flying school, and thinking it was open to everyone with enough talent to do it, and found out that it couldn't be done. But it's something that I've always liked. Here it is 60 years later, I still love it. There's nothing in the world beats being a pilot, as far as I'm concerned.
Mr. Lowery, we heard about the record of the 477th support personnel, the best safety record in the 1st Air Force. Tell me about the training you received and how you were able to put that to use and achieve that record.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm glad to be able to associate with this, because I have often been questioned about saying I was a Tuskegee Airman, because I wasn't. A Tuskegee Airman kin, that's all. But we were serving under the same commander. General Davis was our commander as well. And so I just wanted to clear that up. I don't want to be under the thought that I was a Tuskegee Airman, because I understand there's a certain prestige that goes with that. But I also have a prestigious story to tell myself. But I went to Lincoln, Nebraska. I was coming out of Kelly Field, Texas. That was where I enlisted in. And my whole thought was to get to be a mechanic. I wanted to be a mechanic because as a child, I always had just wondered what kept those planes up there. And that was always something that I was concerned about. So I wanted to be a mechanic. And I enrolled in it and got into Lincoln, Nebraska, was where I was trained in an airplane mechanic school. Of course, they trained for various different types of aircraft, all pursuit planes, but we were schooled on the radial engines that were used on the B-25. And not until I got into surface field that I made the transition into being able to use that skill on B-25s. What they had some white mechanics, and they had white pilots that associated and familiarized the pilots as well, the use and different quantities about the B-25. That's the same way they did with the enlisted men. We worked right along with them. In fact, it was a period that we worked together for quite some time. And I will say that I guess just comes with being a mechanic or with a pilot, that all these, there were some differences that we experienced, but then it seemed to be a genuine feeling that just transcended among the men that we were working with. And they were very fruitful in trying to teach us the skills about handling the B-25. And there were some troubles that they had in surface field that I wasn't involved in, but the only involvement I had was when they shipped us to Godman Field, Kentucky. And that was where, well, that's where the trouble started. But anyway, I think that's what you want to know about
You'll have to explain to people what that trouble was.
Well, I don't even know where to start because it was all over. First of all, the living condition was so bad. We had barracks, I think they were left over from the old CCC. I don't know if you all remember what that was, but that was a program they had during the Depression with the NRA and the CCC. That was Civilian Conservation Corps. They just had things that the men had to do so that they could be employed. But these barracks, I think, were used with that because we didn't have any water facilities in the barracks. Our latrine was in a remote place, and just to take a shower or use the facility of the barracks, you had to walk down the street and into a little out place, and they had their own fire boiler where you could heat the water for that. So consequently, baths was somewhat of a limited thing. And in the barracks, it was just one big pot-bellied stove. That's just, in the mess halls, everything was on a dispersion system. We had nothing that was in a combined building. And we had to walk for everything we went to. And the line facilities, that's where I felt the most of it because it was a short runway. And it was hard for to use it for B-25. But I think what happened, and they weren't aware of it, that just made a better pilot because they were able to use those short runways and excelled in it. And going to the mechanics, we had the same problem. We only had one hangar that we couldn't use, so everything that was done for maintenance on those planes was done out in the open. And at night, we didn't have any light. We worked by flashlight, by feel alone. But what did that do? That just made us a better mechanic. And in the wintertime, the snow, we'd have to deal with the snow. We have to uncover the planes. We have to de-ice them down, and everything for them to fly. We were flying 18 hours a day. So that was 3 shifts that we were sending up. And we had limited facilities on Godman Field. We couldn't go over to Fort Knox, which was a joining field right across the railroad track. So we would go over there just out of necessity, because some things that we could get there out of the PX and various other components that we couldn't get on Godman Field. We had our own theater, which was in the gymnasium, but sometimes the pictures that we wanted to see were over in Fort Knox, and that was what he spoke about. We had to go over and sit in the 2 back rows when they had Italian and German prisoners of war that had the freedom of sitting anywhere. They went all over the base. And I think they're using for sign painters or something, but they had some menial tasks that they had to do. But we were just, I guess everybody was so devoted to their planes, and I think we all shared that one feeling of just wanting to be, wanting to do, and that's what instilled in ourselves the capabilities of maintaining those planes. We had stripped down engines they sent us. We got recap tires. The thread would come off on one landing, but we'd have to change wheels and send them right on back up. So it had about maybe a half hour to 3 hour to get the plane ready for flight for the next crew that would take over. But that and several other things that happened. I never went into no town because I was just wanting to be out there in the plane, so it didn't bother me about what the civilian, how they accepted us in town.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Colonel Mcgee, we mentioned the unmatched combat record that the Tuskegee Airmen compiled in combat. Tell me about the training that you received and the attitudes that were instilled in you by your superiors, Colonel Davis and others.
Well, I think that began with the instructors that we had, that they didn't have to change the standards. They just assured that we got the time in and we were able to get into the air. I certainly began to enjoy it. But as we moved on through our training and into combat, I think a lot is owed, in fact, I know a lot is owed to Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who became our commander. For those of you that don't know the history, when he graduated from West Point in '36, he said, "I want to be a pilot." The Army told him, "No, we don't have any black units," which meant a black could not command a white unit. He entered into the training as a captain. They quickly promoted him to lieutenant colonel to be with his counterparts who had graduated from the academy. But we respected him. We were certainly young, race second and first lieutenants, and to approach a lieutenant colonel in the Army in that day brought its own respect. But we also respected him because he let us know what the mission was. And I'm speaking particularly, we could go into the history of his commanding the 99th in Africa, Sicily, and India, but then coming home to take command of the 332nd Fighter Group, and that's where Lee and my experience comes in. And we moved from tactical work to begin the escort work, the strategic work, switching from the P-39 to the P-47 Thunderbolt for the strategic escort work, and then later the P-51. But what he said, your job is protecting the bombers that you're assigned to. And out of our respect for him, I think we probably flew closer escort. And by the way, when we got the 51, we ended up with 4 fighter squadrons in the group, which means many times we put up as much as 72 aircraft, 16 per squadron. But he said, I will court-martial any pilot I find going happy hunting. And we understood what that meant. For those of you in the audience that don't know what happy hunting is, it's one of those unfortunate things, I think, that takes place in military structure, and that is a pilot's desire to be an ace is so strong that he will forego the mission he's assigned to try to go get a kill. A kill is shooting down an enemy aircraft. And there are cases where pilots have thrown away their bombs so they could go chase an aircraft. Colonel Davis said, you stick with the bombers. That we did. We were dispatched if a bomber, a fighter, tried to attack the aircraft we were escorting. We've seen German aircraft in the air. If they weren't attacking the group we were escorting, we would just say, hey, they lived another day.
Yeah, it's my understanding that that your mission was to escort the white pilots who were flying bombing missions and so forth. Tell us what kind of relationship, if any, that you have with those pilots who was, did you ever see them face to face and talk to them? And if so, what kind of talk did y'all do?
Yes, we talked to them sometimes. In fact, a lot of them claimed, even up until a couple of years ago, they didn't know we were black pilots in the airplanes. One of them at the Confederate Air Force convention about 5 years ago demanded to speak to tell us about his relationship with the Tuskegee Airmen overseas. And he says, well, we were never told. Apparently the Germans knew because they welcomed us with speeches from Lord Haw and named us where we came from, our hometown, and everything else. But the bomber pilots claimed they didn't know. Our base was separate. We were never on a base with any other group. We were alone from Capodichino through Ramitelli. The fellow described, he said, well, we see you guys sitting out there, and the only thing we knew about you were the red tails on your airplane. He said, you're sitting in there, and his alibi was you have a helmet on, goggles, you got an oxygen mask across your face. He says you got a white scarf covering every part of you and gloves up to your elbow. So you look like any other person. And I took offense, and I said, we are like any other person. And he said, for God's sake, don't carry this too far. Okay?
Well, there were some cases slowly crippled bombers trying to get back to their base, which were farther south in Italy than ours. And there was also an emergency strip where Allied aircraft that had been damaged and couldn't get back home would land. There were some black mechanics there. We've had a bomber land at the field. And folks, we had both sides of that coin. We had some were glad to get on the ground, go to the mess tent and get a hot meal and share a cot for somebody that was absent till they could get transportation back home. And then we've had others who landed and found out it was a black base and they were ready for a cold truck ride. They refused to eat or sleep and stay. So the word slowly got out that there's some blacks flying, but it was very slow. And as Lee said, for those folks that said he flew low enough that I could recognize him, that's a war story, not a fact, because you can't identify with all of the gear that you're wearing. So many knew that the Red Tails were providing good escort. It was only much years later that they found out that the Red Tails were the black pilots and mechanics who had been there in Europe, and even coming home, we're still separate for quite a long time until the Air Force made a decision that they needed to use people based on their skill and experience where needed, and they weren't getting enough money for trying to maintain a separate base on an equal basis, and they made it an intent to change, and change they did.
I think that one of the things that's important is that while we were overseas in combat, we didn't mix it all. We stayed separate bases. We weren't permitted to use the officers' clubs of white officers. And in fact, at Capodichino over Naples, we had our own club in a house up on Via Pasilabo. It was such a nice place that we had on it. The Air Force people, Air Corps people in those days that knew us, we had good guys and we had bad guys. Everybody wasn't there. Some people just went along with it because it was the rule. And in fact, I always attribute the fact that the changes that came because of the Air Forces becoming a separate service and integrating shows something about American society and what America can really be if it wants to be.
I just want to add, I think that we were in training with the B-25s. We trained 2 or 3 times, and I wasn't in a position to know exactly, but I know from the training that we were getting, we were being processed for war combat. But for some reason, I guess it was because of these guys that we never got anywhere. We just stayed on this side because they made such a reputation. I think they were afraid to assign us to any wing over there. So we were processed, I think, about 3 times to go, but no one would take us. And we, several times, we were talking about in the ground troop, and the base that we were at, that was an all-black base. And sometimes we'd have white pilots that come in, and they'd be so surprised when they see the service crew coming out to them. They want to take off again, but they wouldn't allow them because they didn't want anybody to touch their plane. And we had gone someplace. We had flown. I flew with the planes, and when we get there, they would want you to land, you know. So it was a twofold situation. I'll tell you about one incident that we had out here at Bowling Air Base. It was a 5 or 6 man crew that B-25s would hold, but we had a practice of transporting people that had to go back and forth so quite often, and that was done throughout the Air Corps. That if it's a plane going someplace, that you could book a ride or get on and fly with them. So by coming to Washington as often as we did, quite often it would be people that wanted to come along. So we'd have maybe 10 or 12 people on the plane, which it wasn't unpracticed because everybody did it. But we got word one time from Bowling Air Base back to our home base, which was on Godman Field, and said you had to come and pick up some men because they would only allow that 5 men to come back on that plane. So we had, I don't know how many guys were stranded. So it was just up to us to try to figure out a way. And I spoke about our officer personnel. There was a lot of them from San Antonio. We had enough there to form a group. From mechanics, we had one of the guys on the gasoline truck was from San Antonio. And by us all being from a black school system, that was just we were just like brothers anyway. So one of the pilots, I'll say, was from San Antonio. That's as far as I'm going to go. He said, come on, little Lowery, let's go get them. So we came on up here to Bowling Air Base. And we had a pre-arranged situation, so those guys would know we were there. And they came running out to the plane, and we got on at the end of the runway. We looked up, and it was some MPs coming on Jeep, trying to stop us, but we took off anyway. We did all right, but the thing that I think was a bad situation, he turned around and buzzed the tower. So they said, no, come back no more. So I think that put the weapon in the hand to keep us out of Bowling Air Base because we never landed there anymore. We went out to Andrews. I'll tell you about an experience. I don't want to take all this much time, but we got out there and I came in. Again, I was a flight engineer. You go with the plane so you can make repairs, and then there's a pre-flight inspection and a daily inspection that has to be done before the plane is suitable for flying. So we came out, and it happened to be a bad snowstorm that night that we were here. So I went on out to the Andrews Air Base anyway, and the major that was the pilot on the plane, the other guys didn't come, but he came on out in a civilian car. So he saw I was there, but I hadn't done anything. So I went over to the car, and we exchanged a military greeting, and he asked me had I performed a pre-flight. I told him no, because the field is grounded, and you could see the plane was covered with snow. I hadn't done anything. So he said, well, what about a daily? I said, well, do you think that's necessary? He said, well, I think it's necessary. So I had to go over there and pull a daily inspection while he was sitting in the car. And with that, I think they know about to starting up one of those radial engines, you had to pull those propellers through. So I did that in the dead winter time, pull those props through 3 revolutions. And it was some attendants sitting in a little hut off to the side. I guess they were wondering what I'm going to do. But I started them planes up anyway. Started my engines, and I went through my daily inspection. And at the last part of it, you have to rev your engines all the way up to 2,600 RPM to see if it'll do it. So I had it. I was going all the way up, and so I saw those guys running out the little shack and waving for me to cut it down. I looked back, I had snow flying everywhere, and them planes back on me just standing there fluttering. So and then the major drove on off, and I just had to come back to town by myself. But I'm just saying, what we all had to do. But I don't care, because it just, I'd love to go again. It doesn't bother me.
You're obviously very proud of the service you performed and were committed to doing it as well as you could. How did you reconcile your desire to serve your country as well as you could with the sort of treatment you received that you've just described?
Well, I tell you, it's another little story I want to tell you. This isn't military included. But I think it does have a bearing on it because I played with my trumpet through my juniors, high school, college, and into the Army. I played it. But my father was a band director. And so I made A's in the junior high. So when I went to high school, I had to become a band member. So I played for him. And so my first report, he gave me a B. And so that was the first B I got. And so I went home and told my mother, I said, Mama, now he's right here. So she's on my side. So when Papa came home, she got him. And so he had a reason. He said, I know that he deserves an A. He knows deserves an A, but I want him to play so everybody in the band knows he deserves an A. So I'm still playing for Papa. When I went into the service, I deserved the A, whatever I was going to do. I wasn't satisfied with anything less. So whatever they did, I was playing for Papa. And I still carry that attitude now. I don't let nothing turn me back.
Mr. Archer, on that subject, you had a very successful career after the war. Having been a part of the Tuskegee Airmen experience, what kind of difference did that make in your life?
It was the big difference. I attribute everything I've accomplished in life to having been selected as a Tuskegee Airman. Not only because of the friends and that are being put together as we were such a long time and in such conditions in the war and all, we formed a kind of an organization which Charles was president of a couple of times, called the Tuskegee Airmen. And they are what I consider the most talented group of young African Americans I've ever met. And if you want to check on it, not only were they successful during the war, but you check on all of the guys who are still around now and what they accomplished by it. Incidentally, I have a complaint. You keep saying that 50 years from now there won't be any Tuskegee Airmen around. I have no plans of going anywhere. And if you want to talk to me, I went into service as a first beginning sophomore in college. I was pretty bright. I took the test along with the people who had graduated, and I did pass it. All right. The service then, after the war, made me a regular officer. During the war, West Point and Annapolis were the regulars. The rest of us, everyone else all over, black and white, were reserves officers. They lost so many people during the war, the regular army, which meant they were earning their keep, that they decided to build the service up again. And they built it up by having tests and having interviews with us. And some of us were selected. Charles was selected, I was selected. I think it was about 15 of us out of the 250 that then they decided to send us back to school. And so I went off to UCLA. I didn't want to go back to New York University because I figured I'd be in trouble there. It was home. And all of my schooling since then, up to where I have completed it, came because of the Air Force educating me, not only in civilian schools, but in military schools. I go to school if you'd even look at me. It's a great deal. So that was the basis for it. When I left the service, I was best prepared of a lot of people, black and white, to have a new job and a new career. And I did that very well. And so I attribute it to the Air Force and to the military service. I learned so much in it that is remarkable. If I was a failure, it would have been a disgrace.
Colonel Mcgee, what's the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen?
I believe the legacy is twofold, and it's a legacy that has importance today as well. Number one, it's education. We could say, what if? Because when the program started, it required a college degree. We could say, what if we didn't have parents and grandparents that said, go to high school, go to college? Didn't know what you were going to do, but do it. That lesson is still good today because it was an opportunity to develop and begin to bring out what your capabilities were. The other lesson is perseverance and respect. Perseverance, even though circumstances may not be the best, but the other is respect for others around you, seeking that they respect you as you would respect them. We're more diverse now country than we were then, so it's still relevant that we respect others. And I think tied to that education is a school system that brings out the best talents of all Americans, regardless of happenstance of birth. We don't know. In fact, I'm talking to a class, I said, some of the engineering required to resolve that re-entry problem into space still may come from a young engineer sitting in one of our classrooms. So the challenge is there. The lesson of where we've gone technically is important ones. So the challenge is even greater to use that perseverance and dedication today even than it was in 1940s. And for an example, for the young folks that might be in the room, the first jet aircraft that I got in, I stayed in the service because I fell in love with flying, so I got from the prop age into the jet age. But that first jet had 3,300 pounds of thrust. Today, the 757 operates with an engine of just under 50,000 pounds of thrust. But the 777-200 today that flies from Houston to Hong Kong in 16 hours, one engine operates at 90,000 pounds of thrust. Folks, that's in our lifetime. Think of what the advancements and the challenges to the young people for the rest of this century that we're in. So yes, those lessons of education, dedication, perseverance, and don't let anything stop you from doing your best are still important to this great country.
Great words to live by.
Yeah, given all of the all of the hardships and all the successes that you had during World War II, what does the celebration of the World War II monument mean to you today?
Well, one thing, it just makes me proud to be able to see this, as many people out there now that are interested in what we have to offer. And it makes me just feel that everything that I went through and what I did is a successful ending. And so just like any good building, it has to be a good foundation. And I consider myself as being part of that foundation for whatever is achieved today.
Well, truthfully, I've been waiting for this day for a long time, like 60 years. And I often wondered why it didn't. But what I'd like to explain to you is that it came about because people who followed us. When I speak to anybody, talk to them, I try to do a little work for the History Channel, trying to get the jobs and these stories out to everybody. And it comes from all sorts of people, and I'm very proud of that. And if I take two little quick incidents, show you the difference that has been made in the services and all like that. I remember reporting to a commander who, when I came in to be his executive officer, saluted and said, Lieutenant Colonel Archer reporting for duty as instructed, sir. He popped his head up and said, oh, I didn't know you were colored. And when I took that about it, he then said to me, he said, Well, you know, I'm not sure about integration, but we'll give it a try. Now, there was one kind of person in it. The second story is short. One is that I reported while I was at UCLA as a student. I was told to go to another airfield, March Air Force Base, to get my flying. And when I reported at the Air Force Base to do the flying, they panicked. Aren't you supposed to be at Lockbourne with the other black officers? And I said, yes, I am, but I'm here on a special occasion. A couple of days later, trying to get some flying time, there had to be 2 pilots in an airplane to get flying. We were short of gas in those days also. The pilot who was there to fly with me looked up and discovered that I was again African American and refused to fly with me. And the operations sergeant then called the commander. And the commander came down and said to the pilot who refused to fly me, what's your problem? And he told him what the problem was. And he walked over to me and says, okay, Archer, what's your problem? And I said, I have no problem, I want to fly. So he then called the other captain over to me, and he was standing there, and he says, okay, let's get this straightened out. He said, how much flying time do you have, to the other pilot? And he told him. Then he asked me how much flying time, and I told him what I had. Then he said, have you been to combat, to the other one? And the guy said, no. He said, I'm in training command. And then he turned to me, he said, yes, and I had my opening. So I blasted him. Yes, sir, I flew 4 airplanes in combat. I have 5 victories. I 160. I bragged all over the place. And he said, so. But it then occurred to me that this other fellow was a captain, and he had never been overseas, and I was a captain, and I had just come back from flying over a year in combat. And it went on like that with this colonel, who was the group commander, going back and forth. And finally, I realized that he had a goal. And so he said, well, he says, I don't know, looking at the records, Archer, said, I don't think I'd fly with him. And he walked off. That was the end of the conversation. The pilot then says, okay, I'll fly with you, fellow. And I said, the hell you will. And I'm spiteful. And then the sergeant who was at the desk called me over. He says, Captain Archer, he said, the colonel said that anytime you want to fly, you could fly alone. So I ended up flying for the 3 years I was in college, anytime I wanted to, by myself, against all rules. Incidentally, the colonel that I'm talking about ended up being 3-star general in charge of personnel for the United States Air Force. And I'm quite sure that his kind of person and his kind of reasoning is one of the things that made the integration of the services such a big success.
I want to give you my impression of just the other side of that coin that he tossed. I always was told that there were 2 sides to everything. Now, I went through a lot of that, just what he was speaking about so many times that I can't remember it all. But one thing that sticks in my mind, one time we had a flight to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and it was a RON. For those that don't know what that is, that's remain overnight. Well, I didn't have clothing to go into town because I was always ready for the plane. And I couldn't find any place there on the base that would allow me to, because I didn't belong to this squadron, I didn't belong anywhere, so nobody let me come into the barracks. So anyway, I decided to stay all night on the plane, which I'd done several times, there was no problem. But ironically, there was a B-24 that had parked right next to me, and there was a white engineer in that. And we became friends, and we spent the night going to each other's plane and going all over. So I was so thrilled to be able to get the experience of fooling with the B-24, and I let him play with mine. So we spent the night doing that. So I was glad for that. I didn't need to go into town. Thank you.
Colonel Mcgee, we have just a few more minutes left, so we'd like to close with your reflections on the opening of the memorial.
My feeling is that this memorial is built to not let us forget the time when America, with all of its problems and diversities, came together and were successful. I think it speaks to the future, and I hope that the spirit of not only all of the veterans that have gathered here by the hundreds, but the families who had others participating in what this memorial is set that we not forget. But that spirit spreads throughout the country and provides the same type of spirit going into the future, that our United States of America remains the #1 country in the world.
I want to add a piece of advice to what Chuck said. We've come along since flying school together, 1 month apart in class, same combat unit overseas, 302nd Fighter Squadron, the best. And right. But when people get our age and have our experience, what we do is watch who's coming along behind us, who we're turning it over to. And we're turning it over to you young people out there, not the other 80-year-olds around here, but the young people. I personally am very pleased with what I've been seeing over the last years with them. It's your hands now. It's your fight. Keep it going.
On that note, we'll have to close. I do want to tell you that if you'd like more information on the Tuskegee Airmen Oral History Project in particular, which is an official partner of the Veterans History Project, we do have yellow flyers on the tables by the doors. We're always looking for more candidates for interview. If you should know of one, please let me know. My contact information is on the sheet. The gentlemen will be happy to answer questions, take pictures, sign autographs. We do ask that you allow them to get off stage and over into the far corner before you accost them, because we don't want to intrude on the next.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.